An airliner operating from unpaved airfields, a jet plane connecting neighboring villages, and a 3-turbofan machine that can carry 30 people. Hello aviators, Sky here, and today we will get acquainted with one of the most widespread Soviet civil aircraft, which has won the title of a cult classic and at the same time a controversial aircraft that can still give delight to any aviator and a heart attack to any economist. A civil product of a military designer, the Yakovlev Yak-40. And so, the history of this work begins in the 1960s. All of my stories begin in the 60s. Turboprop and jet engines conquered the skies around the world, including the USSR, where the most advanced aircraft of their time were born. However, this concerned mainly the medium and long-haul routes. Local transportation lagged behind. The Il-2, Il-12 and Il-14 of course were well-deserved piston veterans, but then they started looking dull. And this was despite the fact that they accounted for almost half of all air traffic in the country. There were quite a few solutions to this problem, and surprisingly, the options were quite exotic. To understand what the aviators came up with, we need to figure out what was required of them. So, it was necessary to replace the veterans who could accommodate about 30 passengers and flew at a distance of just over 1,000 kilometers. They were simple, modest, and not too demanding to the infrastructure. They often worked on unpaved airfields and airstrips 700 to 800 meters long. Now, these machines had to be replaced, moreover with something worthy. You need to keep in mind the era. Progress in aviation became an obsession not only for the aviators, but in general for everyone, including politicians of the highest ranks. The aviators decided to make a jet plane with 3 or even 4 engines, the Vanguard. By the way, Yakovlev Design Bureau did not even stop there, and as part of its carrier project was working on a version of an aircraft with vertical takeoff and landing. Those were the 1960s, everyone was going crazy about it. Trijet Design Bureau, in turn, was working together with the Antonov Design Bureau on a 3-engine An-Air-20 project. The guys from Ilyushin also conducted their project. The Il-70 was planned to be a small jet plane with 25 seats and R-19 engines in the tail. Besides, due to the low thrust, there was supposed to be 4 of them at once, a kind of small Il-62 or something close to the Lockheed Jetstar. But 4 engines were too much. The Ilyushin engineers were running late with the 3-engine project. The An-20 didn't work out. There was a shortage of resources, and Antonov himself, working on his An-24, was skeptical of the local jet aircraft. So, the order was eventually received by the Yakovlev Design Bureau. They obviously were not wasting any time. Officially, the work began in April 1965, and in October 1966, the prototype was already in the air. Yes, the plane is not the most complicated. They were engaged in it before that. The traditions of rapid creation of military equipment had an effect, and the development of other design bureaus quite possibly found their use. But 1 year. Nowadays, 1 year can be spent discussing the overall layout. This is how the Yak-40 was born. So, let's figure out what kind of plane they created. When viewed in general, the Yak-40 is quite miniature. 20.36 meters or 66 feet in length, 25 meters or 82 feet wingspan, T-shaped tail unit, 3 jet engines in the tail section, simple glazing, several doors. The layman would immediately say that this is some kind of an average business jet, but no. Given the tasks, this machine is very unusual and interesting. The first interesting thing is the main entrance. The Yak-40 was made for simple local airfields with minimum of equipment, so the entrance to the plane was at the bottom of the tail section with its own descending ladder. In principle, a fashionable solution for that time. Similar options could be seen, for example, on the Caravel or the DC-9. The wing of the aircraft is trapezoidal and low-mounted. It is almost straight and thick, allowing to maintain flight and control at low speeds. It was a compromise. Good controllability and takeoff and landing characteristics cost the plane high speeds, 510 to 550 km per hour or nearly 300 knots for a jet plane was very modest. For the same purpose, coupled with low demands, the mechanization was simplified. The wing is equipped with large retractable flaps and ailerons. There are no slats here and, moreover, no spoilers and aerodynamic brakes either. a rather radical minimalism that simplified mechanization and, what's just as important, freed up more space in the wing for fuel tanks. With the empennage, they decided not to make experiments. It is T-shaped here, quite a classic scheme for a trijet. The horizontal stabilizer is relatively modest in comparison to the hefty fin. Considering the conditions in which the Yak-40 was supposed to work, an off-road landing gear was made for it. It is simple, tricycle, but very powerful, with an advanced system of levers and shock absorbers. A noticeable feature of the landing gear, the wheels are very large in comparison with the size of the aircraft. The main landing gear has one large wheel each, with hydraulic disc breakers that reduce the landing distance. At the same time, to simplify the design, the flaps in the center section covering the wheels after retraction were abandoned. In principle, quite a logical solution that is often used on larger aircraft. The front landing gear is also one-wheeled and also has a rather large wheel on a reinforced support. However, there are no brakes here. The function of the front leg is, as expected, steering on the ground, so it is turning. Since we are in the tail, it is time to get acquainted with the main highlight of the aircraft, the power plant. It is represented here by the AI-25 turbofan engines, created in parallel with the Yak-40 in the Yakovlev Design Bureau. The engines were good, a bypass ratio of 2:1, thrust up to 14.7 kilonewtons, and small dimensions. They were attached to the Yak-40 and then to several more aircraft, the most popular of which, of course, was the L-39 Albatross. There are 3 engines. 2 are installed on the sides of the fuselage, and the third is located inside the tail section, with an S-duct air inlet brought out of the fuselage in front of the fin, approximately like in the Tu-154 or Boeing 727. The aircraft is equipped with a target-type thrust reversal mechanism. Curious, usually there is no reverse, but plenty of spoilers on the wing, but here it is vice versa. It was considered that the reversal is obligatory to reduce the braking distance. It does its job. An airstrip about 800 meters long is enough for the plane. The reverser is unusual. The bucket is not installed on the engines, but is integrated into the tail section. This is a separate mechanism. It is easier to maintain this way. All motors are identical without additional systems. Meanwhile, to compensate for the lack of wing mechanization, so to speak, the braking functions are enhanced. The Yak-40 is not shy to apply reverse even before touchdown. This is something found in aviation, but here it is in fact standard practice. Of course, the plane has an auxiliary power unit, the miniature gas turbine AI-9, which has also become quite popular in aviation, however mainly in helicopters. The APU is located inside the air inlet fairing, in the space behind the second engine duct. When describing the power plant, you cannot get around the questions that arise. 3 jet engines, devouring fuel like mother's soup. The fuel consumption is more than 1,200 kilograms per hour on an airplane with 24 seats. It was nicknamed a kerosene killer. For comparison, the CRJ-200 or Embraer 145 burn about 1,100 kilograms per hour. Yes, these planes appeared much later, but they were full-fledged regional airliners, more capacious, heavy, long-range, high-speed, and at the same time still remained profitable, mainly in the 1990s with low fuel prices. In the 1960s, this niche was dominated by turboprops, much simpler and much more economical. So why? The turboprop power plant was discarded almost immediately when creating the aircraft. Such planes were always very noisy and were perceived as kind of a temporary compromise, while the jet engines were more comfortable and, in opinion of many, would soon take all the winning places on the pedestal. The newest aircraft had to be advanced and progressive. But 3 engines. First, reliability and safety. Nowadays, jumping across the Pacific Ocean on 2 engines is not a big deal, but at that time failures were not uncommon. More engines is safer. An airplane can take off if 1 engine fails, and the flight continues even if 2 fail. Plus, the distribution of thrust reduces the load on each engine, which makes it possible to increase the resource, with which, again, it was tough then. It may have also been difficult with the choice. The AI-25 was the newest and most promising engine, perhaps with insufficient thrust, which was very important for the Yak-40. Other options were often too powerful and voracious, and even if there were two of them installed, there is no guarantee it would have turned out better. And fuel consumption, a lot of course, but in the USSR the 1960s and 70s, it was not really a critical problem. The limited range was more embarrassing, about 800 to 900 kilometers at full load. Well, with such a consumption, you can never have enough tanks. Okay, it's time to get inside. If we enter the plane as we should as passengers through the tail ladder, we will find ourselves first in front of the door that seals the cabin. It will be a little more difficult to show further. In our plane, the cabin has been dismantled, so let's use our imagination. Passing the door, we find ourselves in a small room, which houses a toilet, a wardrobe, and a luggage compartment. The Yak-40 is a miniature plane, and there is no place for luggage under the floor. Passengers take everything with them, leave their belongings on the shelf, and go to the cabin. Something similar was later scaled up on the Il-86. At last, the passenger cabin. In the basic version, it accommodated 24 seats in a configuration of 3 seats in a row, 2 plus 1. Then, to increase the capacity, 1 row was added here, reducing the luggage compartment. Now it had 27 seats. And finally, making a cabin for 32 seats, they decided to keep the luggage compartment, and the increase was achieved by switching to the scheme of 4 seats in a row. It became more cramped, but there were more people. The rest of the cabin equipment is quite simple: open luggage racks, individual airflow, and light. The windows are round and small, but the square frames on the cabin's casing make them look a bit larger. It is worth noting that the air conditioning system on the Yak-40 is simplified as much as possible and gives a rather modest excess pressure. This factor severely cut the flight altitude. The ceiling of the Yak-40 is only 6,000 meters. In principle, for an airplane of local routes, it will do just fine. Many classmates have no pressurization at all, and the altitude is modest. But for a jet plane, 6 kilometers of course is pretty low. It's time for us to look into the cockpit. The Yak-40 was designed to be controlled by a crew of 2. However, it was decided to return the flight mechanic here, sitting him on a reclining seat in front of the pedestal. The control system was, for its time, on a high level. Double hydraulic system, decent automation, mechanized control. There are no fancy solutions, but everything is in its place. The aircraft is quite obedient, well controlled, and forgives minor mistakes. Such loyalty became for Yak a guarantee of love from the crews. There are even stories about how the Yak-40 performed a barrel roll. Of course without passengers and without much advertising. From the point of view of safety standards, this is a big no-no. The first prototype was assembled by the fall of 1966 and made its maiden flight in November. Already in 1967, serial production began, which was established at the Yakovlev site at the aircraft plant in Saratov. Regular flights were first deployed in the Moscow region and nearby areas. The first flights were performed from the Bykovo airfield. Actually, in memory of this, the Yak-40 is depicted on the coat of arms of the Bykovo village. The power plant showed itself very well. However, everyone immediately drew attention to the love of the AI-25 to smoke slightly. The smoke trail behind the Yak-40 quickly glued the nickname cigarette butt to it. But those were in the 1960s, no one really cared about the ecology of air travel. But the excessively high specific fuel consumption nevertheless was not amusing, so the aviators decided to slightly increase the mass and capacity. The thrust-to-weight ratio allowed it. The early series aircraft carried 24 passengers and had a maximum takeoff weight of about 13.7 tons, or over 30,000 pounds. Quite quickly, the number of seats was increased to 27, with an increase in weight by 1 ton. In the early 1970s, another series of upgrades was carried out. The plane became heavier by another couple of tons, received enlarged fuel tanks, and its capacity increased to 32 seats. Of course, various exhibition and administrative options were created, many special modifications, transport and cargo, meteorological, flying labs, and so on. The concept of a small trijet, for all its controversy, made the Yak-40 unique. Here, as a rule, it is necessary to throw a standard phrase, such as, "Those guys over there in the West could not create this." But the explanation for this is simple: they didn't really try. In the Soviet economic system, such an aircraft could well exist. After all, it fulfilled its task, and the costs fell on the state budget. In a capitalist competitive environment, its profitability would be, let's say, low. In this debate, we can mention the use of concepts similar to the Yak-40, for example a modern jet aircraft with the ability to operate from unpaved runways, the Pilatus PC-24, or most obviously the Dessous aircraft, small trijets. But with such machines comes a lot of nuances, the main of which is that they are business jets and the economy there is completely different. Nevertheless, despite the fact that the Yak-40 was a very specific vehicle from the point of view of the transportation market, there was a certain demand for it. In some niches it could have shown itself well, and there were no similar vehicles, they were simply not being made. This factor became the basis of the rather curious part of the Yak-40 history, international. The brainchild of Yakovlev was very actively demonstrated at international air shows and demo tours around the world. It was interesting to foreign operators, including the Western European ones. It was a very interesting experience for the Soviet aviation industry of that time, accustomed to delivering only to the USSR and the Allies. The experience was positive. The Yak-40 became the first Soviet aircraft certified in Western countries. The first deliveries began to Italy and Germany in the early 1970s, but the work was getting delayed and there were constant problems with both deliveries and customers. As a result, the Yak-40 march to the west ended with the onset of the 1973 oil crisis. Kerosene prices skyrocketed, and the plane, with huge fuel consumption, dropped out of all the notions of efficiency. By that time, only a few aircraft had been delivered, and most of them eventually returned to their homeland. The promising markets for the Yak-40 were regions with less developed infrastructure, where the aircraft could demonstrate its capabilities to the maximum: South America, Africa, and Asia. The Yaks performed a series of tours there, while passing tests in various weather and geographic conditions, quite successfully. However, the matter didn't go well here either. The supplies were rather modest and went not so much to the civilian sector as to the military and government structures. Nevertheless, in the Soviet Union itself, the fleet modernization program, for which the aircraft in fact was created, developed on a grand scale. During the production period from 1966 to 1981, 1,011 planes were built, which makes the Yak-40 one of the most mass-produced Soviet passenger aircraft. It connected several hundred regional airports, carrying millions of passengers across the country. By the early 1980s, a program to increase economic efficiency was launched in the USSR. The economy must be economical, as the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev once said. The program also took up aviation, and it was then that the plane, which already bore the name Kerosene Killer, started having problems. After some time, the Yak-40 at the Saratov aircraft plant gave way to the Yak-42. Of course, the Yak-42 cannot be considered the successor of the Yak-40. This is a completely different plane, so the 40s in a sense remained unique. The same factor became the reason that it continued to be quite actively operated further. Economy is economy, but there was simply nothing to replace it with. Strange as it may seem, the 1990s became the second wind for the Yak-40. The time for aviation wasn't great, but for the plane it turned out to be lucky. The fragments of the giant Aeroflot received a decent fleet of these machines, and they could not replace them because there was no money. Meanwhile, the cost of fuel was very low, so the main drawback was not critical. The operation was active and, at times, rather wild. Fully packed planes with overloads were not such a rare occurrence. Unfortunately for the Yak-40, and fortunately for the rest, the fuel prices soared again by the beginning of the 21st century. The airlines started getting rich, and the plane once again became terribly inefficient. It began to quickly leave the parks. At this stage, the idea of transferring Yak to the business aviation industry arose. A small jet airplane doesn't sound bad, and all these administrative versions were business jets anyway. However, here the initial role of a local airlines plane began to play against it. Low demands and the ability to work with unpaved runways were not particularly important on flights between large airports, but the speed, range and altitude for a business jet were completely unacceptable. But the Yak-40 did not give up. The aviators from Sibnier Institute, already known for their tuning of the An-2, took up its modernization. Instead of 3 AI-25s, they installed 2 Garrett TFE-731s, which greatly reduced fuel consumption. Together with the new composite wing, this gave impressive results. A range of about 4,000 kilometers, a ceiling of 10,000 meters, a speed of 650 to 700 kilometers per hour. The new STR-40DT aircraft turned out to be not bad, even taking into account that it was named like a ballistic missile. It must be said right away that the idea was not to establish a new production, but to modernize the existing fleet. This is much cheaper. The ideas were going even further, up until the replacement of avionics and the addition of composites to most of the airframe, including the fuselage. Although in this case it becomes unclear what remains of the old aircraft. Just as unclear at the moment remains the fate of the project itself. Given the current economic situation and the state of the local air transportation market, everything is very vague. The Yak-40s are slowly fading into history. Over the entire period of operation, the aircraft participated in many incidents and disasters, as a result of which 107 aircraft were lost and 864 people died. In defense of the aircraft, it can be noted that most of these cases were not the result of critical technical failures, but pilot errors and external conditions. The operation of a jet aircraft on local routes with not the most developed infrastructure is not an easy thing, not to mention a decent number of terrorist attacks and attempted hijackings. By 2021, the overwhelming majority of the fleet has already been decommissioned, with only a few dozen aircraft flying in several countries. Such is the story of this iconic aircraft. Comment what you think about this machine, I know you have something to say. And also, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Fast flights and soft landings to you.